Good evening, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Andres Velasco. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy here at the LSE, and I would like to welcome you to this book launch. We are delighted to be hosting tonight Steve Schwarzman. Steve needs little introduction. He is a graduate of that great institution called Yale College and of Harvard Business School. He has had a long and distinguished career in finance. And of course, he is the founder and CEO of the Blackstone Group, one of the largest and most successful private equity firms in the world. Steve was also very interested in and active in public affairs, and he is an active philanthropist who's contributed to a number of leading universities and who is perhaps known in the world of philanthropy for his work to help the West learn about China and to foster mutual understanding between China and the rest of the world. We're here tonight to discuss what it takes, lessons in the pursuit of excellence, which of course is the title of Steve's recent book, in which he discusses, you guessed it, what he learned in the process of building a great company and of leaving his mark on the world. What we're going to do tonight is have a dialogue between the director of the LSE, Baroness Minouche Shafik, and Steve. Steve will tell us about the book, then Minouche and Steve will have a conversation, and we will save the last 45 minutes to half an hour of tonight for a Q&A with the audience. And I should add that we have lots of people joining from all over the world, and we thank you for joining us in this conversation. So Minouche, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres, and welcome, Steve, virtually to the London School of Economics and Political Science. It's great to have you here. So I'm going to start my questions with your own personal story and then move on to issues of philanthropy, politics, and the current crisis and its challenges. So let's start at the very beginning. You start the book by talking quite a lot about your family, and you speak with great affection about your parents. And they clearly played a huge role in shaping you. Tell us a little bit about what role they played.
Well, my mother was an extremely aggressive individual and always wanted good things to happen for us. And my dad was very smart. He was a track athlete in high school and college, and he ran a store with his father that looked a little like what we call in the States Bed, Bath, and Beyond. They basically had towels and sheets and curtains, and that's what he did for a living. He had a wonderful sense of humor and was a very kind person. I had two twin brothers. I was not the twin. They were younger than I was. And we would laugh at meals, and we always had a good time, but it was quite clear we were meant to be competitive and successful. But I've now deconstructed this and realized the way you do that is you never really tell your children that they've done a good job. And there's no achievement, which actually warrants almost any recognition, which then takes this little rabbit and has them continuing to run around a track or something. So it was a happy environment, but there was no real, as we say in the trade, attaboys for getting good grades or winning races or doing anything distinguished. It was just assumed somehow that you would do that.
Interesting. Well, so you talk also with affection about someone who didn't also provide a lot of praise, your high school track and field coach, who you described as teaching you to have a high tolerance for pain. Could you say a little bit more about what role that played in shaping you?
Sure. He was, his name was Jack Armstrong. He was brilliant. For those in the audience who ever competed in high school or junior high school, I was never on a team that ever lost a meet. And that's not because of me. You know, in his history, he had a record, I think it was like 184-4, something like that. So that means that that individual could take anyone randomly from high school and turn them into as good as they can be. It was all about the coach, not just the talent. The talent always thinks it's the talent, but that's not the way it worked. And so you knew you were in the hands of someone with enormous domain mastery, and you would do for him whatever he asked. And in fact, the training was so rigorous that we all looked forward to meet day. This was like a day off. You only had to run 2 or 3 times. It was nothing to it. And so you were just so happy to not be training that, of course, you know, you'd have the ability because of his training to win. So it was really great. And I love the camaraderie. And we were, I guess we came in 4th in the United States and the junior championships or something, and state champions. And I remember always being pushed completely to the limit, where you'd basically be on the ground doing something unattractive with your lunch. And, you know, that was what was the order of the day.
Amazing. And presumably you took some leadership lessons from that track and field coach.
Yeah, what you learned is he was very funny. We'd be out, miserable weather, and he'd be dressed up in his maroon outfit with his stopwatch and whistle. And he'd sort of, as you go by him running, he'd say, well, you got to make some deposits in training so you can make withdrawals on game day. And so you knew why you were there, and you play your heart out for him. And it shows in terms of lessons learned that you can be a completely decent, inspirational person. And kids will sort of go that extra mile for that individual, for their affection, if you will, and approval and excellence. So he was a remarkable guy.
Let's move to when you started your business career. And in the book, you have a quote where you say, entrepreneurs are made, not born. That's probably very reassuring for all those people out there trying to teach entrepreneurs and incubate entrepreneurs. When did you realize that you wanted to become an entrepreneur?
Well, I didn't know there was a title, and I probably couldn't have spelled it anyhow. It's a long word. And, you know, I always liked doing things. You know, I started a lawn service, and I would get the customers, and my brothers would do the work. I thought that was a great division of labor. It was a lot harder to do the work, but I convinced them that it was harder to get the clients, because if you don't have any revenue in this primitive model, there is no business. And so we expanded that. And I would do almost anything to get some money, only because, you know, I think my allowance was like 10 cents, which depends. It doesn't matter which country you're in. When somebody said you got 10 cents for a weekly allowance, that meant not much. And so if there was anything I wanted, I had to create it. And so I was always doing new things. When I was the head of student government, I basically said, I don't want to be a normal head of a student government. Let's come up with something new, something nobody's done. I always liked that concept because it's fun. It pleases people. It demands a certain level of conceptual ability and imagination, but also execution. And so I was like that, but I really didn't understand that kind of talent to put on a rock and roll concert with a #1 in the United States group without paying them. That was a good trick. Nobody thought we could do that. That could be translated into anything as an adult.
Well, so exactly on that theme, you've got a wonderful quote in the book about thinking big because it's just as much effort to think small. And so you may as well think big. And I've also heard you talk about your philanthropy in the same way, that it's about being transformational and having a big impact. But that approach also means you're running big risks. How do you think about that balance between risks and rewards in your business life in particular?
Well, we only go wrong with our assumptions, right? So the assumption that there's big risk with doing big things is not true, in my view, and the way it's worked out. That the key of doing something that's really significant is waiting till you come up with a situation where everything lines up, where you can see it. And as soon as you see it and evaluate where you are, if it's something that's compelling, it's got to be completely compelling. It's got to be very substantial, can be expanded to meet, sort of a huge aspiration. If you see something like that, you just do it. You don't hesitate. But it's hard to find things like that. You don't do it by just sitting around. You have to, at least in my case, you have to see things that stimulate it. So whether it was starting, the Schwarzman scholars at Tsinghua to deal with China, relationships with the rest of the world, a modest aspiration, and getting the president of the United States and the president of China to endorse something like this, and raising all the money. We've raised somewhere around $550 million. I put up about 125 of that so far. That was just a wonderful idea, conceived in 2011, when you could see, China's acceleration in the world, and sort of the broken glass that happens as a result of that. And so I just looked at that one. I'm just giving you that as an example. At what the Rhodes had done sort of in the British Commonwealth, and their reputation around the world. And if we could get a group of people who was extraordinary and bring them to China and let them learn, so they can go back to the rest of the world and explain what was going on from their perspective, and also feed back to China what the world was thinking about what they do, that could be a fascinating group of future leaders that could potentially impact the dialogue between the two countries. Well, that turned out to be a very good idea. And we just finished the admissions last Sunday. I think students were notified for the next class, and we accept like 4% or something of the applicants, and they come from great schools like LSE, where it's already tough to get in. And so whenever I sort of go into action, it's in response to some large trend that I see, and a solution for what I think is easy success, just because of the nature of the forces involved in those large situations. And then I bring on people who are tens on a scale of 10, who could help me get that done. And then we build something. And so I don't view these things as just sort of conventional philanthropy on the one hand, or commercially, we do the same thing. That's how we started, with no assets, and now we've got close to 600 billion, sort of a miracle in a way.
Let me ask you about the risks, though, because you launched this this kind of massive bridge building visionary program between the US and China. And now, of course, the trade war has erupted. There are huge tensions between the US and China. How do you see the risk that you took with Schwarzman scholars? And do you still remain optimistic about the prospects for a broader understanding between the US and China?
Well, I've got a good friend, Hank Paulson, was US Treasury Secretary, and Hank said to me at the time, Steve, the timing for you doing this is absolutely perfect. It'll never be, it was never done before, it'll never be done afterwards. And nobody else could have raised that much money and marshaled, the forces that created that. And so, when I look at it, Minouche, looking backwards, I go, wow, that seam was pretty narrow to get that done compared to what I thought at the time, which is why, as a rule for the people who are listening, when you see something that's going to work, you just go at it with such speed and such focus, because you never know how long anything will stay in place when you're dealing with very significant forces, some of which are cyclical type forces, others of which are evolutionary. You just don't know. Just because you see it doesn't mean it will stand still waiting for you. So in answer to your question, obviously, things have gone on a track now that's very difficult, with China and rest of world. Somewhat exacerbated, I think, by a change in US policy, as well as, to some degree, China policy really changed significantly. And those two forces leave the world in a bit of confusion as to where things are going to be going. And, we have a new administration coming up in the United States. And so there'll be a different tone. There'll be a different measured approach. There may be a lot of similar policies, but not all of them. And, we may be looking today at close to a low in terms of relationships with the US and China. And I think both countries look at that and go, boy, this is not so good, this relationship. And the idea of doubling down to make it worse strikes me as a little bit illogical. And it may well be that this provides an opportunity for people on both sides to look at this and say, okay, we've each established our bona fides. This doesn't work very well. Where might we go where there's some mutual overlap? We can build some things.
You mentioned hiring tens. And in the book, you talk about how in the beginning, when you're first starting, you can't really recruit the best people, but then once you get established, you can really hire the best people. I think a lot of our students would be very interested in hearing from you. What are the top 3 professional attributes of a 10? What do you look for in a 10?
Well, there are more than 3. One, you have to be...
You can give me more. I'm sure they're happy to get the advice.
It's helpful to be quite smart. You have to be able to see patterns or see things of where you should be going and where you should avoid danger. You have to deal well with stress. You can't have that affect how you handle things. You have to have a certain personal chemistry so you can connect with other people, either to sell them things or recruit them. 10s hire 9s and 10s. 9s hire mostly 8s. 8s hire 7s and sometimes 6s. You don't want them because it's not optimal for your mission. If you're at the beginning of building something. I also think in terms of 10s, they have to be able to have some EQ. Just the idea of being super bright and an oddball it works in certain sciences which aren't potentially more team oriented. But if you're working with humans, establishing trust, being honest, being authentic, being accessible to other people, is very important. And what happens when you have a 10, you know it. Nobody has to explain to you what you've got. If you recruited Michael Jordan in the basketball business, you would know Michael Jordan, LeBron, Kobe Bryant, that's just basketball. You know it when you have people at the university who gives great lectures, who's oversubscribed, who's doing breakthrough work, how much of a breakthrough, and sometimes you don't know that immediately. It's, you see that over the course of time. Who do you want to recruit as your best junior faculty? You're not looking for 8s or 7s. You're looking for 10s. And so how do you gauge that? And it's pretty easy to identify. The final thing I'd mention on this is that very bright, nasty pieces of work don't have a place in my life. I've met people like that. I used to work with some of them when I was younger. They always sort of scared me and made me feel uncomfortable. And now you realize you can find amazing people who actually are nice, and it creates a much better, more productive environment.
So let me take you to questions of the skills for public life. You've got a chapter in the book called Answer When Your Country Calls, and you yourself have played a role in politics and public service. Now, our School of Public Policy at the LSE is in the business of producing leaders for public policy, and we've got a decent track record at the LSE of producing more than 37 premiers, presidents, and prime ministers around the world. So what would you advise our students who are considering a career in public affairs and public life? And how might that be a bit different than what you would advise someone going into the business world?
Well, we produce a lot of people for public life at the Schwarzman Scholars, and they go into large departments, typically, occasionally, elective office. That's different than the business community, where you're going allegedly to make a profit, although now, much more diverse portfolio of responsibilities that you have. When I was young, I sat down with a wise man. His name was Averell Harriman, and he spent some time in London during World War II. And he was ambassador to Russia and dealt with the Lend-Lease program and so forth. And I said, I'm interested in public service. And he said, young man, I was at his house, which itself was amazing. Young man, are you independently wealthy? And I thought that was some kind of joke, except I realized how rich he was. And I said, no, I'm not independently wealthy. He said, that will make a great difference in your life. And consequently, I recommend you go into business, make as much money as possible, and then you could go into politics and no one will own you. So, I was 21 years old. I said, okay, that sounds good to me, which is what I did. And, I'm not a politician. I'm a business person, and, I try and help my country. I think certain of us, through the accident of our lives, I was saying before we started to Minouche that George W. Bush was in my college at Yale, which is like a dormitory, if you will. It's like a college at Oxbridge. And I met his father there as well. And both of them became president. And I've met other people accidentally in my life, and I'm just like a straight middle-class person. This is all like a dream in a funny way. And so when you know people, it's very easy if you have a knowledge base that they don't, and they want to know something. It's very easy to help. And so I like helping people just sort of generally as a person. And when your country needs some help, if a president reaches out and says, what should I do with this? Or can you help me think this through? Or something of that type. geez, what a privilege to be able to help your country. That's it, how I look at it. And from being around some of these people, being an elected official requires different skills than a business person. Business people don't have this compelling need to be loved. They're more well-adjusted, and they have enormous domain expertise in something that they're doing, whereas political people tend to be much broader and not as knowledgeable typically about certain areas. So when they take their positions, they're being asked to do a lot of things which they aren't completely comfortable with. And if you can help, what a wonderful thing to do.
So let me bring you back. You mentioned your time at Yale, and I think you studied what we would call social sciences at the LSE. And we, pride ourselves on being the best social science institution and top ranked in Europe and the UK, and we think social sciences help us understand the world. You've invested a lot in artificial intelligence, and I think you have a strong belief that it will transform our societies. So as a social scientist, tell us why you think AI and big data are going to change all of our lives.
Well, I loved studying social science, and I was in a major that you could have had in the late 60s called Culture and Behavior. And you had a seminar twice a week. I guess you call it in the UK a tutorial with your little group of 8 people in the major, along with a professor of sociology, anthropology, biology, and psychology, I think, biology, and anthropology. It was a study of the human being. And I was always curious about human beings. Why do they do what they do? Why don't they do other things that are sometimes logical? And I've used that. I never have had an economics course. Somehow I've managed to cope. I never had an accounting course either. And, so you can pick stuff up like that. And you look at systems as if they're alive and human, and figure out where they're going to go, what they're going to do. It's some form of pattern recognition, if you will. Now, with AI, AI is such a powerful technology. When deployed in different areas, it'll progress knowledge, progress research, and enable humans to do some things they couldn't do. It should make a big impact, for example, in the educational area, and lead to more distributed education in different parts of the world that right now, you have to go to great universities. At some point, you'll be able to tune in to great universities, which you can to a degree now, but it's just the start. And we're seeing it now on a Zoom. It's pretty amazing, right? I mean, I'm in New York, you're in London. I was just on with China, earlier today, and some other places. We're transforming the world. Now, AI itself can benefit a lot of different areas in pharma, for example, and medical discoveries. The power of AI is going to be quite profound. On the other hand, one reason that I'm interested in this field is that there are potential bad things that can happen to humans, like unemployment or discrimination or other things that can really hurt people's lives. And so how you deal with a new technology that's profound is worthy of a lot of thought. One thing I would share with you, which I found stunning when I gave some big program to MIT and their School of Computing. And they had an event to sort of kick it off for the university. And they had the great people of science, one after another, come up on the stage for like 15 to 20 minutes. And each one of them said, "We're sorry we invented the internet. What a disaster. If we had only known, we wouldn't have done it." And I'm not a technical person. I'm just sitting there thinking, what? When the first person said that, I thought that I hadn't heard it right, or he was like an odd person. But one after another. And what they said is, we thought when we invented the internet and pioneered it, that it was going to be great in terms of moving information around the world, connecting the world. Actually, we've unleashed a monster that's threatening liberal democracies, creating tyrannies, leading to lack of freedom of speech by bullying people and all kinds of things. And if we could go back, because we don't know how to correct it now, and we've launched the world on a course that that none of us could have even anticipated, that with AI, we're not going to do that, because in effect, we've learned, and we have to be careful about what we do. And there has to be a balance between what we can do scientifically and what we should do for the benefit of humans.
Interesting. So let me bring you to the current state of the world. And in particular, in the book, you talk a lot about how you can turn crises into opportunities. And I guess we certainly have a crisis at the moment. So this is the moment. What do you think needs to happen so that this terrible pandemic crisis doesn't go to waste? What should we learn from this?
I think this pandemic has really affected virtually every person's life, and the ability not to travel, and leave aside people getting ill and some not recovering so well, and other people with mortality, and voluntary stopping the economies of the world almost simultaneously with enormous economic damage. For some people, it's completely tragic, and all those corollaries of depression and alcoholism and drugs and not going to hospitals and sort of because you're scared of getting COVID, and you don't test yourself for cancer and you get cancer. There's so many bad things. There's lots to be learned. One from preparation, which we all did just about none of as societies. There's observing what's worked and thrived in this pandemic in terms of the use of technology and development of technology that works for people. But the miracle of it is, even though we've got this huge spread and people can't go to bars now or parties or whatever, there was an announcement this morning by an American company, Moderna, that they've developed a vaccine that's 94.5% effective. This is like a miracle. So without having great math skills myself, I can't imagine a world where in the best case, everyone takes a vaccine, take a developed country, everyone takes a vaccine, they're 94.5%, there ain't gonna be a lot of COVID after that. That's gonna just snuff that out. Now the question of how much time does it take to get there? What kind of delivery system do you use? Because a lot of this stuff, at least these two, the first two, Pfizer and Moderna, need a lot of cold to preserve. It's unclear that that's going to be the case with the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. But I mean, imagine we did this as a culture, educated people in the science area did this in less than a year. This is a miracle. And so even though things are terrible right now, and that's when you turn on the news, that's basically all you hear. That's true, they are terrible. But if you look out, sort of 6 to 9 months, you're probably going to have vaccines much more distributed, obviously, than now, which is zero. And it'll start affecting the economy, the human spirit. And within a year, if you take a year from today, without my going out on a limb and sawing myself off, it's hard to imagine you won't have profound changes in people's psyche and all kinds of good things or used to be familiar things reestablishing themselves. And that raises a bunch of other questions, of course, which is who gets the vaccine, what's the sequencing, how fast can it be produced, and a variety of other questions for ethicists. There's lots and lots and lots to be learned in our country. We've seen that death rates among certain ethnic groups are way higher than they are for others, and that healthcare generally, we don't have the benefit of UK healthcare. You see, we don't have the National Health Service. That some people get amazing healthcare in the United States. Some can argue the best in the world, and other people don't. And the consequence of that from a societal position is sort of unsustainable. And how do you fix that? And so there are all kinds of profound and serious questions that have been revealed and need to be answered as a result of the pandemic.
Just to follow on that, I think a lot of people describe the economic consequences of COVID as sort of K-shaped. We had this sharp drop, and then some sectors are going to do well, and some are never going to come back. What's your take on the K? What parts of this what sectors will be permanently transformed and maybe never recover? Retail, those kind of things, and which ones do you think are going to benefit enormously from the pandemic?
Yeah, well, you can do it both ways. Which ones really work, which ones won't. I think in the won't category, what the pandemic has done is accelerated trends that were already happening. So, for example, physical retail was losing out to online, and it just became supercharged. And that's not going to come back in nearly the same way. And the value of malls and other types of physical retailing are going to be really hurt, very much the way newspapers were hurt in the prior cycle with disruptive technology. It's going to take a while for international travel to come back. That'll probably be the slowest to recover. There's the whole issue of work and where work is done. How many people are going to work remotely? Are they going to be coming to their offices never, once a week, 3 times a week, 5 times a week? There are certain occupations that may be different in that regard. So, for example, what we're finding is that our IT people really like working from home and are much more productive, whereas our investment people, our deal people who operate in groups, they enjoy being back. And
introverts have done better than extroverts in this crisis.
Yeah, so what you learn is there are different styles. There's also, in our country, for example, it doesn't have to follow in yours, though I think a little bit, is people are discovering secondary cities and other places to live as opposed to just being, in a few major cities, which is, they're making somewhat different choices with their lives. On the other hand, the stuff that's really rocking and rolling is in technology, and it almost doesn't matter what it is. Almost everything is either being disrupted, or it's a disruptor, or if you have a decent sized company, you've got both phenomena happening at the same time. And so how you manage that, and how you think about it, and how you position things, there's really a revolution that's going on. On the other hand, because people are fleeing urban environments, at least temporarily, housing is booming. And anything that touches a house, everybody, besides Netflix, everybody wants something good, something improved in their home because they're there all the time. And so that's developed. Cars, surprisingly, because nobody wants to fly anywhere. And in our country, it's a pretty big place. If you're not going to fly, how are you going? And also, just being in your home sort of drives you half nuts. So you just have to get out. And so cars, surprisingly, are doing extremely well. So I think we have to monitor this, but it's really resulted in huge winners and losers as a result of the pandemic.
Let me, last question for me. One of the most striking things about your book is the acknowledgement section, in which you thank, it's quite striking that you thank, from presidents to people who were very personally close to you, and kind of everything in between. But you also thank people across the political spectrum, ranging from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. And you've managed to kind of bridge the political polarization that we see these days. Now, particularly in light of the recent US election, how do you think it might be possible to overcome the polarization that seems to characterize so many societies, particularly the US, particularly after this election? And how can we unify our societies again in the wake of this?
Well, that's a great question, and there's at least 330 million people who would like to know that right answer, who are in the United States, let alone, the other developed world countries where there's a lot of friction, and a lot of that friction comes from social media. It's very difficult to manage a liberal democracy with people constantly attacking everything you're doing if you're a leader. Technology has basically blown a hole in the media world, because once you lose your advertising, you're sort of hard pressed to survive unless you go to very narrow verticals where you can assemble an audience. And that narrow vertical almost demands, sort of a slanted, biased, selective, you get the right adjective, type of news, which people take in as if it's truth. And I'm talking, sort of both sides, if you will, of issues. And so, we have some structural issues now that are problematic to get back to a more balanced world. In our election, which was interesting, we had a new president, who's got the most votes now, it looks like, Joe Biden. And on the other hand, what was supposed to be a huge left of center wave, there was no left of center wave. In fact, it was right of center. And how do you explain something like that? It's that the people didn't want to go extreme one way or another. You have populations that are basically saying, boy, each of these areas, of extremes are threatening. They're threatening to freedom of speech, cancel culture. How do you have a normal dialogue with people who believe things like that? So I think there's a need to reestablish a center. Not everybody is an extreme on one side or another. They get popularized by media. And so you think that's what a country is. As it turns out, since we just had a large-scale vote with, I don't know, 160 million people, they've said that's not us. That's not who we are. And so I think you have to start out with a unifying figure, man or woman, whoever it is, who can bring people together and be rational and calm. I think you have to be transparent with issues and talk about, sort of the benefits of going either way. I think it's a tough task for a leader, but I think we have a society that, despite the fact that they've broken apart a bit, who actually wants that. People don't want to live with these extreme issues, each side of which thinks if they don't get their way, they've been threatened. I don't think that has to happen like that. I don't think society basically wants that. You could have 20% of the people, 10% on each side, just say, to not be controversial, who might want to feel that way. But the rest of us, we'd sort of like to just live our lives and make our contributions and sort of do good things. We don't really want to be involved with those passionate issues that seem to motivate people.
Okay. Well, let me turn it over to my colleague Andres Velasco, who will now moderate the very, very many, I think there's almost 100 questions that have come in. So Andres, you have a tough job of synthesizing the questions. Over to you.
Thank you, Minouche. The number is rising every second. I think 97 and rising is the actual number of questions we have received. So I will apologize in advance to many people who have sent questions and who inevitably will not get to hear that question posed to Steve. But we have we have a fair bit of time and lots of very good questions. We're going to start with two questions posed by an LSE student society, which is actually co-sponsoring this event. That is the LSE Alternative Investment Society. And they've sent in a couple of questions, and because they're co-sponsors, we have agreed that we will start with those. The first one, Steve, is this. You've said that you don't think you would get hired by Blackstone today, but you're clearly a 10, having built up Blackstone. Do you think the firm's process for recruitment is going wrong? Or do you think that the kinds of 10s that firms are looking for have changed across time?
Well, I give that a lot of thought. At our management committee about a year ago, I was thinking about this issue. So I asked everyone around the table, how many of them were Sumas? Can they put their hand up? And there were no hands. Then I asked how many were Magnas, and there was one hand. And then I asked everybody else who's a cum laude. There were no hands. So I said, so the rest of us are just like astonishing losers, but we're running the place really well. And what's wrong here? I mean, do we need losers like us? We're hiring all these Sumas and people who we could never equal in terms of intellect. And so it is a very good question. In a way, it's horses for courses. What do you want somebody to be doing? If you want somebody to be looking at a completely sort of uncertain group of information, you find it there if they're really good at pattern recognition, which doesn't necessarily correlate with being a Summa, which is sort of a logical way of thinking. My partner, when I started the firm, was assuming he could figure out anything, but it did take him a while. I could usually figure it out almost instantaneously. That's why we were terrific. He was a check on what I thought, and we were, a very good team as a result. So you need a mix of people, and you need people who can do different types of things. We were just so excited that we could hire all these amazing people that we've hired them, and they're really great. But sometimes, for different types of things, they won't look for what's not working so much as somebody who isn't as highly logical, that just observes something and says that's a precursor of something that's not going to work. And it's not an exclusive pattern of thinking, but it does show you there's a lot of room at the inn, if you will, for different styles of thought.
Actually, there's a student who says that he or she, I'm not sure, there's no name, applied for a summer internship at Blackstone. I was turned down. And so the question is, what advice would you give me to turn my career around and have more chances next time?
Well, you should tell that student they're in the vast majority. So we had 88 positions and entry-level positions, and we had 21,000 people apply. So my math skills aren't so good, but that's a bunch below 1%. As an admission, it's really hard. So what I would say is to be hired in any really good organization, you have to have good grades. You have to have the ability to show that you can achieve things, not just be smart. You have to show there's human understanding, because all of us are observing events, except when we're doing data analysis. But even then, you have to say, what does that mean? What's that really telling you? What's the person going to do at the end of that chain? And so I can't give you as neat an answer as to how to get through that thicket of all those people. So I'll stop talking on this one.
Right. But on that note, and this is the other question from the Alternative Investment Society, you mentioned pattern recognition a couple of times, and in the book, you mentioned that old TV show, Name That Tune, in which, the competitors just hear one or two notes and they have to recognize the song. So there are really two questions in one. First of all, looking at the world, what patterns do you recognize today that people should be aware of? And secondly, for students, what advice would you provide so that they can improve their skills at pattern recognition?
What I'd say is you should be aware that there's almost nothing that's stable. Almost everything is going through a period of dislocation and movement, and sometimes good for you, sometimes bad for you. And so you should figure out where the world is moving and try to place yourself in an area that will benefit from your skills. In the olden days, when I was young, they actually had industries and companies that were there for 100 years. I think there's some statistic of what the sort of the age of the company is now, and the Standard & Poor's 500, and it's shrunk down enormously. And so we're living in the age of accelerated change based around technology. And so you need to prepare yourself by recognizing that, and that will give you opportunities for things. And if you're not alert, when I went into finance, there are no patents in finance. So I did the second interest rate swap, and we got a fee of 1%. And I think they do them now for one hundredth of a percent. the margins just collapse. So I was introduced to the concept that nothing is stable very early. Most people aren't. The things they see around them, they assume will always be there. That's not necessarily true.
Well, the world certainly looks anything but stable, at least to me nowadays. We have lots of questions about sort of lessons from your experience, Steve, and let me bring two of them together. The first one is, what do you know today that you wish you had known at age 18 when you were starting in college? And the other one is, given your life since, what do you think the role of luck is in success? And is your answer today to that question the same as it would have been 40 years ago?
Geez, what I didn't know when I was 18, as they say, could have filled a book and you just got it. And I learned that people aren't always nice. I used to think people were nice. And, sometimes when you're competing, it can be a big pie, but they think it's a small pie. And sometimes they'll do something to defeat you, which is not, doesn't meet a moral or ethical construct. That's one of the things I learned. Another thing I learned is that when you do innovative things, most people have no interest in that. In other words, you can come up with a new concept to do something that's absolutely going to work, and you can share that with someone, and they go, oh, that's interesting. And then they just go back to what they're doing, as what you've invented or identified is going to basically make their lives very difficult. People who are having success don't want to change what they do. It's a shocking thing. I always love, sort of discordant information and, sort of what's happening underneath the hood in a way. Most people, they'll just keep doing something that works until it doesn't work. The key in life is not to wait until it doesn't work. You're supposed to see the next new thing. But people's lack of curiosity and fear of abandoning the paradigms that have gotten them to wherever they are is reasonably stunning. And it's not even in their self-interest, but they do it anyhow. So those are some things. I've also learned that the world will really make way for new things if you have a powerful idea. And but it's the power of the idea. It's got to be powerful. It's got to be something that can drag along a crowd because it's so wonderful that you can assemble enormous resources in our society today. And that's something I couldn't have imagined. And the value of luck, that's an interesting question. So sometimes you're lucky when you meet someone, right? But you meet them because you're in a certain place. How did you get to that place? It's because you weren't in some other place, right? You chose to be somewhere. You chose to be in the traffic, if you will, where you would meet someone. And so yes, the actual meeting of the person or learning something it involves luck, but that luck is a culmination of a whole variety of other decisions that you make. If you're only doing something where one piece of luck works for you for the rest of your life, you are one lucky person. The rest of us, not so lucky. We have to keep reinventing things, doing new things. So luck, in that sense, may help you get started, but it is not a sustaining principle And in a rapidly changing world, if you think you're going to depend on luck to prosper or win the game or do well or whatever you define a positive, nobody's lucky that often. You may have one piece of luck, you may have two pieces. You need so many decisions in the real world that luck itself may be a starter, but it's not a strategy.
There are a few questions, Steve, about the value of an MBA. And I'm looking here at a question from Humberto, who's a Spanish student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., who says, in your book, you mentioned that you were close to dropping out from Harvard Business School. Do you think in today's society and in today's business world, have MBAs lost their value? Would you advise someone to get an MBA?
Well, I don't think they've lost their value. I think technology and the rapid access to data and information in today's world, you could argue, might make it a little less necessary. What I found probably 15 years ago, so I'd have to update it, is that you could do the computational elements of entry-level jobs quite well, and continue to learn. What we used to find is when you hit about your fifth year, you started struggling because you could do everything perfectly, but you didn't have the context to think things through, to understand how everything was integrated. And so what we found is that students or younger professionals weren't going to make it all the way through the system because they were, quote, missing something. And so we had a policy that they should go and get an MBA because there is something to be learned. I mean, if I didn't get an MBA, I wouldn't be on your video. I'll tell you that. It was really central for me because I didn't know anything. And so, as I said, I didn't have an economics course. I didn't know what I was doing, except, I was pretty good at certain things, but, for me, it was, advanced education, which was also base level, education for me. Now, some of our people at work go through without going back for an MBA. Some of them, happen to be extraordinary people, and we're better at teaching them now because society generally is a lifetime learning operation. If you're in a knowledge business, you have to keep educating your people. You're not done. And so we can substitute a bit for that. On the other hand, well-trained MBAs, they're excellent. And so I like the MBA program. I teach a case on Blackstone once a year at Harvard Business School. And these people are so much smarter than my group of basically dodos back in 1972. These people who are back are great. And hiring them is an extremely smart thing for people to do. So I'd say I'm pretty much of a booster, no doubt, for MBA education.
Thank you, Steve. We're up to 147 questions. So I've been trying to sort of ask them in blocks. Most of the questions so far were about sort of life lessons and some of the main ideas and points in your book. There are also a lot of questions about finance and the role of finance. And one way to summarize those questions might be this. Finance is important for economic growth and developing and getting resources to people who have good projects. But people add, several questions make this point. We've also seen some behavior in finance that was not exactly stellar, We've seen recently one MDB, Wirecard, of course, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we had the world financial crisis and some dealings there which were not exactly exemplary either. Where is finance, and in particular, where is regulation going wrong? And what needs to change to avoid this kind of thing in finance?
Well, that's a good question. There's so many different answers to that. You know, when you give people access to credit in large amounts, many of them will do things that are wise. Just given the array of humans, you know, some will do things that are really on the line, so there is a you know, there's a role, you know, for regulation, and on the other hand, the system itself basically works pretty well, and even today, given the pressures on financial institutions, given the problems with the pandemic, they're holding up amazingly well because regulation has worked. One thing that I've looked back over my life, I've known almost every decent sized criminal in the financial community. And I've met these people and I usually do nothing with them. It must be like a sixth sense. The only one I really didn't know was Madoff, because he didn't want to be known. He kept away from people like me. He was smart because we'd sniff you out. So what have I learned with all these weird humans? They're mostly impatient. They want to get someplace before the system allows them to get there. They're people who cut corners. And you usually can sense that with people. Some are highly convincing people. It's just an assemblage of a large group of people. If you get, you know, sort of hundreds of thousands of people and assemble them, you'll get a few rotten apples, if you will. But the system itself has worked pretty well. Occasionally it gets interfered with by the political system, which drives financial institutions to do unnatural acts. So you know, part of the antecedents of the global financial crisis in 2008 was government mandates on lending to people who couldn't afford to pay back mortgages. And so what happened, that was a government mandate. And so by the time somebody invented securitization, so that whoever was making the loan thought they were transferring the risk to someone else, the number of loans to that group that couldn't pay back was up 6 times over historic averages. And so you ended up with a crisis of people who couldn't pay loans back. And, you know, there wasn't full disclosure to them. You know, some of them thought they were getting free houses. I don't know where they came up with that. But had the government not done that, that crisis wouldn't have happened. So there's an intersection of what governments ask people to do, some bad people, you know, sort of weird ones. I mean, the guy from Wirecard I had dinner with in the south of France. I mean, who was this guy? It's like, I don't even know how I got to the dinner. Somebody else invited me to a dinner. He was a guest of somebody else. And you sort of said, what's this company doing? How quickly is it doing it? And so you find these things every once in a while that happen. So I didn't give you a compelling answer because you know, from knowing so many of these people, I shake my head and say, what were they thinking? because it's very hard to keep a fraud going for a while. You can do it. I found one group that did it for like 12 years. They kept moving boxes around in their different factories, fooling their accountants that those were sales. That was live inventory. They were empty boxes. Stuff happens periodically, but the system itself is quite strong. It's quite strong.
Steve, one issue of the day, of course, is finance and the problems and frauds that we've seen there. Another big issue nowadays, and we have several questions about this, is taxes. In the wake of COVID, many countries have run up their public debts, which is a reasonable thing to do in the middle of a crisis. But at some point, those debts have to be paid. And that probably sooner or later in many countries will mean higher taxes. One of the questions asked is that you are on the record as being against a wealth tax in the US. So if it is not a wealth tax, what other taxes need to be raised so that countries like the US can spend more on infrastructure, climate change, education, etc.? And if it's not taxes, how else do we pay for these very necessary investments?
Well, this is the question to which there is no satisfactory or harmonic answer. There are many different ways to tax. You can tax based on transactions. You add transaction fees to things. You increase tax rates on certain activities. You tax individuals in the United States based on what the new administration is talking about. I think we'd be the most progressive in the world. And we already have a society where the top 1% is paying about 40 to 43% of the taxes, but they're not paying their fair share. Where are you going to get this money? How much are these people going to do if they're already doing that? What's happening with the other 99%? And so, you know, each group with taxes always looks and says, well, I'm doing this, why don't you do that? You know, a classic way of dealing with these kinds of issues is through inflation, and in effect, making your debts not as important, you know, for payback. And that looks like a tough thing to do right now, because all central banks are putting interest rates down to close to zero to make sure that the system can finance itself. But I think that you know, nobody's cracked this code of where all the money comes from, as each you know, liberal democracy keeps printing money to, you know, protect its citizens. So I don't have a silver bullet for you in terms of this answer. I wish I did, but I haven't heard anything from almost any you know, sort of government anywhere in the world that really sort of addresses this, because the higher you tax, you also sometimes adversely affect economic growth, which makes it harder to put people to work. So I failed this course in terms of giving you a brilliant answer, but maybe you can answer that instead of me.
I'm a macroeconomist and I love fiscal and monetary debate. So let me stick with this question for a minute. You mentioned printing money forever. That's probably not going to work. You mentioned, you didn't use this term, but you alluded to financial repression, which is forcing people to hold government debt. That's probably not a good idea either. So it's going to have to be some kind of tax probably at some point. Of the options out there, and given, of course, that, you know, tax take in the US is 27% of GDP, and in many other developed countries it's 30 or 40%, which of the tax options would you prefer, if one is necessary?
Well, I don't really know what the right answer is on that. And it's actually something I haven't spent a lot of time on because someone else is going to make that decision for me. what I think about doesn't matter.
Mhm. Well, on that point, there are lots of questions about politics, and let me turn to those. And many, unsurprisingly, given that the United States had an election 10 days ago, are about the current state of politics in the US, and of course, the fate of the Trump administration and of the incoming administration. There are lots and lots of these questions, but let me summarize them in the following way. We have been talking about what you describe in the books as the values of Blackstone, which are values of inclusion and values of doing the right thing. Do you think these values are present and visible today in U.S. politics? Are they visible in what the Trump administration is doing? How should these values inform the administration's choices right now, given that the White House is yet to acknowledge the result of the election?
Well, I think we're at the ending part of an election, and the votes are pretty much all in and counted at least once. We have a procedure in our country where we select what are called electors on December 6th, which isn't too far away. And then they vote, I think it's on December 12th, and then the results are reported on January 6th. And then you have a president. To do that, each state has to have its Secretary of State sort of certify what the results are. And that's going to start happening pretty quickly. And I think you'll get that result, and in all likelihood, it will reflect pretty much where we are today. And then we'll move forward. And we'll have a transition, much like we normally do. In the year 2000, we didn't even resolve a election until December 12th. And now it's, what is it, November, is it the 14th today? The 13th, something like that. And we have an enormous set of pressures on decision making. So I think this it's going to take just a little bit longer. We've had unprecedented types of amounts of votes. We've never had advanced voting like this everywhere because of COVID. We've never had sort of the number of mail ballots. I don't know whether it's 40% of the total vote. This is not business as usual, although it actually is business as usual. There are votes, people count them, they'll rack them up, and we'll move on with the country's transition. And I think the Biden people are already making enormous numbers of plans, and we'll get through this period. It won't be as easy as some other periods, but we'll get through it. It'll be fine.
There are also a bunch of questions, Steve, as you can imagine, about what a Biden administration ought to be doing. And let me ask some of those. And we're beginning to run short of time, so this may be the last question from my side before I hand it over to Minouche. But there were questions about taxes, which we discussed already. There are questions about China. You are a person who's been very involved with China. What a Biden administration ought to be doing vis-a-vis China. And let me just check on, and yes, there are a number of British students concerned with Brexit who say, will a Biden administration make it more likely or less likely that the UK will manage to have a free trade agreement with the United States?
Well, I'd say on that last one, that there's enormous affection for the UK in the United States, despite your burning the White House in 1812 or 13 or something. And, you know, I think people would like to, you know, help the UK. And it's obviously a difficult decision that you all made, and it leaves you, you know, somewhat alone. And so that's usually when people reach out and try and help. And, you know, we're long-term bulls on the UK at Blackstone. And, you know, sort of English common law, the use of English, you know, being clever, being ethical. You have an opportunity to reset your country very much, you know, like some North Atlantic version of Singapore, if you do things right. And so to the extent that you need help, I don't think the nature of whether it was the past administration or the one that's coming up would turn their back on the UK.
What about China, Steve? And while we're in China, there are a couple of questions also in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, some people say, has been fighting for its freedom. How should that be a part of the relationship between the United States and China under a Biden administration?
I think nobody knows the answer to that, in the sense that, you know, when Hong Kong was passed on, it was one country, two systems, but it is one country. And so the idea of how you deal with that, other than protesting, how do you really enforce full levels of democracy as you would have it in the UK? I think is you know, difficult to have on an identical basis. They're going to end up with a different type of system, and of course there was some reaction finally from China, you know, just to stabilize, you know, security and other types of things, and how you thread your way through that, you know, it feels to me to be quite difficult, other than the fact that Hong Kong will function. They're very practical, as you know, and they'll find a way to make Hong Kong work. But in terms of full democratic rights of the type that you would have in the UK or the US, that was probably never fully on the table, and, you know, wouldn't be today. Some version of it would, but not our version. The other question was about China.
Yes. Well, you know, about generally, given your commitment to an interest in China, and given the recent tension between the US and China over trade and many other things, how do you see that China-US relationship developing under a new administration?
Well, I think it's certainly gotten to a point of enormous difficulty now. And you also can't, I think, underestimate the impact of the pandemic having come from China, you know, leaving China as more of a target, you know, for people's anxieties and difficulties, which is added to already a competitive, long-term competitive relationship. And so I think whenever in our country you have a change of administration, you have a change in look, you have an opportunity for certain types of resets. I'm going to be on a video tomorrow morning with you know, one of the top people, you know, in China, who's asked the exact same question you did. And so I'm not going to spill the beans with you, but it is important that we find things that we can deal with that are in the interests of both countries. And there are numerous issues that there are. And I think that's the way you restart, sort of a relationship which really has been sort of beaten up currently and not functioning well for either side. And one thing to keep in mind, since this is the London School of Economics, that the US and China together, depending upon what measures you use, are either 35% of the world economy or approaching 40. I think there are over 220 countries, something like that. And if you have 1% of those countries comprising a third to 40% of the world's economy, this is an issue that's going to have to be addressed, and there's going to have to be a better resolution of issues between them, just because the sheer scale of these two countries is warrants that level of attention.
Thank you, Steve. Well, given the size of both the US and the Chinese economy, we all hope that the two countries will find their way. Just for the record, the number of questions that came in was 176. Regrettably, we are nearly out of time. We wish we had more time to discuss these subjects and others. And I'm going to hand it back to Minouche. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Steve, thank you very much for joining us today. I think your message that good can come out of crises, and that so much of your business success was about being open to change before it was necessary, and being ahead of opportunities for change and not being complacent is probably a very good set of lessons to leave us with at this particular moment in history. And you have led a very interesting life, and as a result, written a very interesting book. And so thank you for that. And hopefully some of the lessons that you've drawn out from your life will be helpful to all of us in navigating some very tumultuous times that still lie ahead of us. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to everyone in the audience for coming, and please do join us for other events at the London School of Economics in future. And have a good evening and take care of yourselves.